Most people think a $65 billion empire is built on vision, but they are wrong. It is built on silence. The silence of the law, the silence of the victims, and the silence of a family that traded their blood for stock options. I stood before the iron gates of the Chin Manor, the cold Pennsylvania rain drumming against the roof of the Blacktown car. Beside me, my lead counsel adjusted his spectacles, his briefcase containing a certified DNA report from a private lab in Zurich and a social security record that had been buried for 18 years. I was not there for a reunion. I was there for an audit. The double doors of the mahogany-paneled study groaned as we entered. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the sharp metallic tang of cold resentment. My biological parents, Thomas and Victoria Chin, sat at opposite ends of a long conference table, flanked by a small army of attorneys. They were in the middle of a high-stakes liquidation, carving up their life as if it were a carcass. Neither of them looked up when I walked in. To them, I was just a 34% glitch in their divorce settlement. Thomas Chin flicked a glance toward his assistant, who slid a document across the table. It was a settlement agreement, along with a check for $5 million. He leaned back, his expression one of bored superiority. I did not look at the check. Instead, I pulled out my phone and tapped a command that displayed a real-time visualization of the Chinlin Group's offshore holdings on the room's smart screen. Victoria's sunglasses slipped down an inch. The room went dead silent. I smiled thinly and said, $5 million is a generous offer for a ghost Thomas. But in this zip code that barely buys a parking spot in a luxury high-rise, let us do the math instead. Chinlin Tech is valued at $65.2 billion. According to the trust's bylaws, my legal entitlement as the sole legitimate heir is 34%. That is $22 billion. If you try to bypass my signature, I will file a breach of fiduciary duty suit before the market opens tomorrow, and the SEC will freeze every asset you own. Arthur, the man they had raised in my place, stood up, his face reddening with a calculated mix of anger and fear. He opened his mouth to speak, but I held up a hand, my eyes locking onto his. I told him quietly, "Do not bother, Arthur. I know what you did to Maya. I have the forensic logs from the night of the hit and run and the transaction metadata from the shell company you used to pay the driver. In this house, the cameras might have conveniently malfunctioned, but my cloud server never misses a frame. Sit down before I decide to make your criminal record part of the public record." I sat at the head of the table, ignoring the check as if it were trash. Revenge is not a flash of anger. It is a long-term investment. My sister Maya was still in a coma, her progress measured in millimeters, and every cent of the Chin fortune would go toward her recovery and their ruin. I looked at my biological mother, who was already calculating the cost of my arrival. I realized then that I was not a Chin, and I was not a country girl. I was the hostile takeover they never saw coming. Welcome home, Jane. Let the game begin. The Pennsylvania countryside in winter is a study in bleakness, a landscape of skeletal trees and frozen earth that match the cold clarity of the digital records spread across my desk. I spent the next 48 hours at the farmhouse, not as a long-lost daughter, but as a forensic analyst. The sound of Sarah's rhythmic sobbing in the next room was a constant white noise, punctured only by the sharp clicks of my mouse as I navigated through the labyrinth of the Chin Group's encrypted servers. I was looking for the ghost that had tried to kill Maya. I found it buried in a shell company's transaction log. Arthur was arrogant, but his accountants were careful. Every cent used to pay off the drunk driver and the hit and run had been laundered through a crypto mixer. But the original Monero transfer had a timestamp that matched a login from Arthur's private IP at the Chin Manor. I stared at the glowing screen, the light reflecting in my eyes as the weight of his malice finally took shape. It wasn't an accident. It was a surgical strike against a girl he thought was a nobody. The front door of the farmhouse creaked open, admitting a gust of frigid air and the heavy polished tread of expensive leather boots. I didn't need to look up to know who it was. Arthur Chin walked into the kitchen as if he owned the oxygen within its walls, his tailored charcoal overcoat looking absurd against the worn wallpaper and the scent of wood smoke. He stopped at the table, his shadow falling across the autopsy photos of Maya's shattered spine. This is a pathetic place to plot a revolution, Jane Ipo. Arthur set his voice, a smooth, practiced baritone that lacked even a shred of empathy. He picked up a photo of Maya in the ICU, her head wrapped in a thick nest of gauze, and let it flutter back down to the table like trash. You think you're a player because you can read a balance sheet. You think the truth matters. But in the world Thomas and Victoria built, the truth is just a commodity we buy and sell. You're holding a handful of sand and calling it a mountain. I leaned back, my fingers interlaced, and looked him directly in the eye. The mountain isn't the evidence, Arthur. It's the law of gravity. You pushed a girl off a metaphorical ledge, and now you're surprised that you're falling too. I've seen the Monero logs. I know about the Viper Club branding on her shoulder. That's not just a hit and run. That's a federal racketeering charge if I link it to your frat brothers at the Ivy League. Arthur didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled a slim black tablet from his pocket and tapped a few keys. A video feed appeared. It was the interior of the private recovery center where Maya lay. I could see the slow mechanical rise and fall of her ventilator. Two men in clinical scrubs, their faces obscured by surgical masks, stood near the power supply of her life support system. My heart skipped a beat, a cold spike of adrenaline shooting through my veins. But I kept my face an unreadable mask of stone. Let's talk about gravity then, Arthur whispered, leaning over the table until I could smell the expensive mint on his breath. The Chin Lin Foundation pays for this facility. It pays for the nurses, the experimental neuroregeneration drugs, and the electricity that keeps that machine humming. One phone call from me, Jane and Maya's charitable care, is terminated. The facility is 4 hours away. By the time your lawyers could file an injunction, her brain would be starved of oxygen for 3.5 hours. Do you know what 3 hours of hypoxia does to a TBI patient? It turns them into a decorative plant. I felt the air grow thin in the kitchen. This was the toxic peak of the Chin legacy, the absolute willingness to use a human life as a bargaining chip in a corporate merger. I looked at the screen, at the silent, vulnerable figure of my friend. And for the first time, the fury threatened to break through my control. Arthur saw the flicker in my eyes and smiled a sharp, predatory expression. You want the 34% He continued, his tone conversational, almost gentle. You want the seat at the board. But every day you fight us is a day Maya's heart beats on our dime. Thomas and Victoria don't care about your DNA, Jane. They care about the IPO. If you sign the waiver, if you disappear back into whatever hole you crawled out of the foundation, we'll guarantee Maya's care for life. If you don't, the power goes out. It's a simple business decision. Don't let your emotions cloud your judgment. That's what poor people do. He stood up, straightening his coat with a crisp, decisive snap. You have until the board meeting in New York, 10 days. If I don't see a signed withdrawal of your claim by then, the facility will experience a very unfortunate, very permanent power failure. The choice is yours. A seat at a table that will never welcome you, or the life of the only person who actually remembers your name. Arthur turned and walked out, the heavy thud of the door echoing like a gavel. I sat in the silence of the farmhouse, the only sound the hum of my laptop and Sarah's muffled weeping from the hall. My hands were trembling, not with fear, but with a cold, vibrating rage that felt like a liquid nitrogen in my blood. He thought he had trapped me in a classic prisoner's dilemma. He thought he could use Mia's fragile heartbeat to silence the truth. I pulled the laptop closer, my eyes fixed on the video feed of Maya's room. Arthur made one fatal mistake. He assumed I was playing by the rules of the world he knew. He thought I would choose between the money and the girl. He didn't realize that I had already spent the last year building a third option. I tapped a series of commands, opening an encrypted channel to an anonymous contact I had met in a security forum months ago. The predator is overextended. I typed the words appearing on the screen in a stark green font. He's using the life support system as a leverage point. We need to initiate the mirrored backup. I need the forensic integrity of the power logs for the facility. If he touches that switch, I want a direct line to the district attorney's office with a pre-filed attempted murder charge. And tell Kyle to get the car ready. We're not waiting 10 days. We're moving tonight. I looked out the window at the gathering darkness. The Chins believed they were untouchable because they held the purse strings of morality. They were about to learn that when you try to snuff out a light, you only make it easier for the shadows to find you. The board meeting was no longer just a hostile takeover. It was an execution. Welcome to the end game, Arthur. I hope you brought your lawyers because you are going to need a lot more than a checkbook to survive the storm I'm bringing to Manhattan. The Manhattan skyline loomed outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of Victoria Chin's private office, a jagged teeth of glass and steel. I sat across from my biological mother, the silence between us punctuated only by the distant rhythmic hum of the city. Victoria didn't look like a grieving parent, or even a conflicted one. She looked like a CEO weighing the cost-benefit analysis of a hostile takeover. I didn't reach for the glass of expensive scotch she offered. Instead, I placed a slim, encrypted tablet on the marble desk, its screen flickering to life with a series of complex legal flowcharts. I looked her directly in the eye and said, Arthur thinks he has me in a corner with his threats against Maya's life support. He thinks I'm a country girl who will trade $22 billion for a heartbeat. But Arthur is playing a short game, Victoria. He's committing a felony to cover a misdemeanor, and he's doing it using your infrastructure. Victoria tilted her head, her gaze sharp and analytical as she scanned the data. I continued, I'm not here to ask for your love. I'm here to offer you a way to insulate the Chin-Lin group from the inevitable blast radius of Arthur's federal indictment. If Arthur pulls that plug, it won't just be a murder charge. It will be a securities fraud scandal that will wipe 40% off your market cap. You've spent 30 years building this. Are you really going to let a reckless boy burn it down for his ego? Victoria's fingers drummed a calculated beat on the desk. She knew I was right. In the world of high finance, a scandal involving the intentional termination of a beneficiary to secure a trust fund was a death sentence for investor confidence. I leaned in my voice, dropping to a cold, steady whisper. I've already initiated a mirrored backup of the facility's power logs, and a private security team is standing by. If Arthur makes a move, the evidence goes to the SEC and the district attorney simultaneously. But if we move now, we can frame this as a corporate restructuring. I sign a temporary management agreement that gives me oversight of Arthur's divisions. In exchange, I grant you a 3-year voting proxy on 10% of my shares. It keeps the stock stable, and it puts Arthur on a leash he can't bite through. The air in the room felt heavy with the friction of our shared ambition. Victoria didn't agree immediately. She was looking for the catch. I gave her a small predatory smile and said, "The catch is that Arthur is going to try to kill me tonight. He thinks he's trapped me. He's arranged a meeting at the old estate, claiming he's ready to sign a settlement. He's already instructed the security detail to disable the cameras in the south wing. He thinks he's found a blind spot. I need you to ensure that those cameras aren't just disabled, but redirected to a secure off-site server that Arthur doesn't know exists." For the first time, a flicker of something resembling respect crossed Victoria's face. She reached for a secure line and gave a series of clipped, precise orders to her head of security. She wasn't doing it for me, and she certainly wasn't doing it for Maya. She was doing it to preserve the value of the Chin name. Once the call ended, she looked back at me and said, "Arthur is arrogant, Jane, but he's not stupid. If he suspects you flipped the board, he will burn everything to the ground. You're playing with a man who has nothing to lose but his pride." I stood up, smoothing my coat with a decisive snap. "That's where you're wrong, Victoria. Arthur has everything to lose. He just hasn't realized yet that I've already taken it." I spent the next 4 hours in the back of a black SUV with Kyle, my hands flying across a mechanical keyboard. We weren't just gathering evidence, we were building a digital cage. Kyle watched the scrolling lines of code with a mix of awe and a newly discovered sobriety. He saw the Monero transactions I had traced back to the Viper Club, the shell companies Arthur used to launder the payoff for the hit and run and the falsified maintenance logs for the hospital equipment. Every click was a nail in the coffin of Arthur's freedom. Kyle finally spoke his voice, quiet. "I thought money meant you could rewrite the rules. I didn't realize you were just a ghost in the machine until now." I didn't look away from the screen as I replied, "Money buys you the pencil, Kyle. Logic writes the sentence." Arthur forgot that the house always wins when the house is the one running the server. By the time we reached the outskirts of the estate, the trap was set. My lawyers had already filed a series of John Doe subpoenas in the federal court, targeting the IPs associated with the Monero mixer. We weren't naming Arthur yet, but we were circling his digital footprint with the precision of a predator. I checked the live feed of Maya's room one last time. My private security team had successfully infiltrated the facility under the guise of an equipment upgrade, installing an uninterruptible power supply that bypassed Arthur's control. Maya was safe, and Arthur was about to walk into a room where the walls were made of his own lies. I stepped out into the freezing night air of the estate, the silence of the grounds feeling like a held breath. Arthur was waiting on the grand staircase of the south wing, his silhouette, framed by the dim, flickering light of a chandelier he thought was failing. He looked down at me with the smug satisfaction of a man who believed he had won the ultimate leverage. He didn't see the tiny, high-definition lenses hidden in the molding or the digital recorders capturing every vibration of the air. He didn't know that the district attorney was already reviewing the pre-filed indictment on a secure server. Arthur leaned against the mahogany railing and said, "You're late, Jane. I was beginning to think you'd lost your nerve. Do you have the signed waiver?" I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder, holding it up so he could see the Chinlin letterhead. "I have something better, Arthur. I have a choice for you. You can sign this confession regarding the hit and run and the subsequent attempted murder of a witness, or you can watch as your entire life is liquidated by the SEC before the sun comes up." Arthur let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed through the empty hall. "You're bluffing. You wouldn't risk Maya's life. One word from me, and she's gone." I took a slow, deliberate step up the stairs, the sound of my heels clicking like a countdown. "Go ahead, Arthur. Make the call. See if the power goes out. See if your scrubs in the ICU can still find the plug. Or better yet, check your personal bank accounts. You'll find they've been frozen pending an investigation into unauthorized Monero transfers from a Chin Group subsidiary. You think you're the master of this house, but you're just a tenant who's behind on the rent. And tonight I'm the one handing out the eviction notice." The look of absolute bone-deep terror that began to bleed onto Arthur's face was the most satisfying reward I had ever seen. The trap hadn't just closed. It had vanished, leaving him standing in the middle of a void he had created for himself. The grand hall of the Chin estate felt less like a sanctuary and more like a courtroom as the clock struck midnight. I stood on the lower landing of the mahogany staircase, the silence of the house amplified by the heavy presence of the men who had just emerged from the shadows of the gallery. My grandfather, the arbiter of the Qin dynasty, leaned heavily on his silver-headed cane, his eyes unreadable as they fixed on Arthur. Beside him stood a man in a sharp charcoal suit, District Attorney Marcus Vance, flanked by 2 federal agents and a senior forensic auditor from the SEC. Arthur's smug smile didn't just fade. It disintegrated. The air in the room grew cold, the only sound being the rhythmic tapping of my grandfather's cane as he descended the final few steps. I didn't waste time with emotional accusations or dramatic flair. I simply opened the folder in my hand and pulled out a series of notarized documents, sliding them onto the marble pedestal table near the center of the hall. I looked at Arthur and spoke with a terrifying calm. "The game is over, Arthur. You didn't just fail to cover your tracks. You paved a digital highway straight to your front door." Arthur tried to regain his footing, his voice cracking as he gestured toward the shadows. "This is a setup. Grandfather, she's manipulating the servers. She's a security architect. She can manufacture whatever logs she wants." He turned to District Attorney Vance, his desperation palpable. "You can't arrest me on the word of a girl who's been back in the country for less than a month." District Attorney Vance stepped forward, his expression as immobile as a tombstone. He didn't look at Arthur's face. He looked at the data. He pulled a tablet from his briefcase and activated a screen mirroring function that projected a series of high-definition internal security feeds onto the wall of the hall. The footage wasn't from the disabled South Wing cameras Arthur thought he had neutralized. It was a secondary hidden thermal layer I had activated weeks prior. The video showed Arthur in the Manor server room at 2:15 a.m. on the night of the hit and run, his face clearly illuminated by the glow of the monitors as he manually overrode the backup logs for the Viper Club's Monero mixer. Metadata doesn't lie. "Mr. Chin." Vance said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "We have the IP handshake from your private terminal to the offshore mixer used to pay the driver $50,000 in Monero. We also have the 0-day exploit signature used to attempt a remote shutdown of the life support system at the Philadelphia Recovery Center 4 hours ago. Fortunately, the facility's power grid was mirrored to an independent server 18 minutes before your command was issued. That is not just a hit and run anymore. That is a pre-filed charge for attempted first-degree murder and witness tampering. The SEC auditor stepped in before Arthur could even draw a breath to protest. There is also the matter of the trust fund, Arthur. By attempting to terminate the beneficiary's medical care to trigger an early liquidation of the 34% shares, you have committed major securities fraud and a breach of fiduciary duty. We have the paper trail of the shell companies you created in the Cayman Islands to absorb the liquidated assets. As of 10 minutes ago, a federal court order has been issued to freeze every account associated with your name and your Ivy League fraternity's endowment. Arthur's knees buckled, and he slumped against the mahogany railing, his face a mask of bone-deep terror. He looked at Victoria, searching for a lifeline, but my biological mother was already stepping away from him, her hand tucked firmly into the crook of my grandfather's arm. She was a master of the pivot, and she had already decided that Arthur was a sunk cost. She looked at me with a sharp, calculated nod of respect. She wasn't my mother in that moment. She was my business partner. My grandfather finally spoke, his voice echoing through the vast cold space. I built this empire on the principle that the strongest lead and the weakest follow. Arthur, you were never strong. You were just loud. You tried to burn down the house to hide a stain on the carpet. He turned his gaze toward me, a flicker of something resembling genuine pride, or perhaps just tactical recognition in his aged eyes. Jane has proven she has the stomach for the throne. She didn't win because of her blood. She won because she owned the logic of the room. I stepped toward Arthur, stopping just inches away from the man who had tried to erase my friend's existence. I didn't feel the rush of adrenaline I expected. I felt only a cold, clinical satisfaction. I reached into my coat and pulled out a small, encrypted thumb drive, holding it up for him to see. This contains the full history of the Viper Club's activities over the last 4 years. The branding, the hazing, the financial kickbacks. Your friends aren't going to save you, Arthur. They're too busy hiring their own defense attorneys. You thought you could use Maya's heartbeat as leverage. Now your own heart is the only thing you have left, and even that belongs to the state. The federal agents stepped forward, the sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoing through the hall like a gavel. Arthur didn't resist. He was a man who had lived his entire life behind a wall of money. And now that the wall had crumbled, he was nothing but a hollow shell. As they led him toward the door, he looked back at the grand staircase, at the mahogany and the marble, realizing for the first time that none of it was ever truly his. I watched the police cruiser's lights strobe through the stained glass windows of the manor, a silent siren song of consequence. Grandfather leaned on his cane and looked at the district attorney. The Chin Group will cooperate fully with the investigation, Marcus. We are initiating a complete internal audit and a restructuring of the board. Jane will be overseeing the transition as the acting CEO of Chinlin Tech, effective immediately. The lawyers and agents began to file out, leaving the three of us in the center of the hall. The air was still thick with the residue of the takeover, but the atmosphere had shifted. The silence was no longer a weapon used to hide sins. It was the quiet of a room that had finally been purged of a fever. I looked at the SEC report on the table and felt the weight of the $22 billion. It was a staggering sum, but it wasn't the payoff I cared about. The real payoff was the notification that had just appeared on my phone, a secure message from the recovery center. Maya's vitals were stable, and for the first time in 240 days, her brain activity had spiked in response to a familiar voice. I looked at Victoria and the old man, two titans who had spent their lives trading empathy for equity. They thought they had found a worthy successor. They thought I would play the game the way they did. They were wrong. I wasn't going to be the next Chin. I was going to be the one who finally liquidated the family's legacy of silence. I turned and walked toward the door, my heels clicking sharply on the marble. "I'll see you at the board meeting at 9 a.m., I said without looking back. "And Victoria, don't bother calling your personal lawyer. I've already put him on the witness list." The iron gates of the Chin estate creaked closed behind the last of the federal cruisers, a heavy metallic finality that echoed through the valley. Inside the grand hall, the silence was no longer thick with the scent of conspiracy. It was hollow. I stood by the mahogany staircase, watching the dust motes dance in the strobe of the fading red and blue lights, reflecting off the stained glass. Arthur was gone, stripped of his dignity and his Ivy League cufflinks, headed for a federal holding cell where his family's name held no currency. The aftermath was a clinical affair of paperwork and liquidations. Per the federal court order, the accounts associated with Arthur's shell companies were drained to satisfy the immediate restitution requirements for Maya's ongoing medical expenses. In the world of high finance, failure is a scent that predators catch quickly. By the time the markets open on Monday, the Chin Group's board of directors had already voted to strip Arthur of every title, every share, and every vestige of his existence within the firm. He was a sunk cost a bad investment that had been unceremoniously written off. I visited the recovery center 3 days later. The sterile white corridor of the ICU felt different now that the threat of a forced power failure had been neutralized by a permanent private security detail. I sat by Maya's bed, listening to the steady, mechanical hum of the ventilator, a sound that used to represent a ticking clock, but now symbolized a hard-won sanctuary. I took her hand, noting the slight, almost imperceptible twitch of her fingers. The neurospecialists had been cautious, their reports filled with terms like incremental cognitive recovery and protracted physical therapy. There were no miracles here, only the slow, agonizing friction of a brain trying to remap itself. I leaned in and whispered, "The bill is paid, Maya, for as long as it takes. You aren't a ghost in their machine anymore. You're the reason I broke it." My biological parents, Thomas and Victoria, attempted one final pivot during the quarterly board meeting. They sat at the conference table, their expressions carefully curated masks of professional grief, hoping to use my presence as a public relations shield. Victoria reached out to touch my arm, her voice a practiced silk. She told me, "We can rebuild the legacy together, Jane. The stock is stabilizing. With your technical expertise and our connections, the Chin name will be untouchable again." I looked at her hand, then at the eyes of the woman who had traded my childhood for a seat on the board. I didn't feel anger. I felt the cold, liberating weight of a superior logic. I slid a finalized legal decree across the table, my voice a flat, decisive rasp. I told her, "There is no together, Victoria. I have fulfilled my duty to the trust. I have stabilized the assets. And now I'm initiating a hostile buyout of your remaining voting blocks, using the 34% as leverage. The board has already seen the audit reports regarding your oversight of Arthur's activities. You have 48 hours to vacate your offices. You wanted a shark to save your empire, but you forgot that sharks don't have families. They only have territories." By the end of the month, the Chin Manor was listed for sale. I watched from the back of a town car as the movers hauled away the mahogany desks and the silk tapestries the physical remains of a dynasty built on silence. Sarah stood beside me, her eyes clear for the first time in years. She had been granted a settlement large enough to start over a quiet recognition of the debt I owed her for keeping the truth alive. Kyle, the man who had once believed his birthright made him a judge, was now working as a junior analyst in a firm that didn't know his last name. He had learned that power isn't a gift, it is a surgical procedure. I returned to my adoptive parents' farmhouse as the first signs of spring began to thaw the frozen vineyard. The smell of wood smoke and damp earth was a sharp, grounding contrast to the sterile boardrooms of Manhattan. My father didn't ask about the billions or the indictments. He simply handed me a pair of pruning shears and pointed toward the south vines. I spent the afternoon working until my hands were raw, the rhythmic clip-clop of the shears, a much more honest sound than the scratch of a fountain pen on vellum. That evening, I sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, sharp shadows across the valley. My phone buzzed with a notification from Zurich, a final confirmation that the Viper Club's digital footprint had been permanently archived with the international authorities. Arthur's trial would be long, a slow grind of legal due process that would likely result in a decade of federal prison time for racketeering and attempted murder. There was no joy in the thought, only a sense of mathematical balance. I looked at the old photo of Maya Sarah had given me, the two of them smiling in a sun-drenched dormitory before the world broke. I realized then that while I had won the takeover, I was still an auditor at heart. I'd spent my life looking for the missing variables, the hidden sins, and the broken connections. I had dismantled an empire to save a single heartbeat, and in the process, I had found the only thing the Chins couldn't buy a sense of self that wasn't tied to a ticker symbol. Revenge is a dish best served cold, but justice is a surgical procedure that leaves a permanent scar. I had cut deep to remove the cancer of the Chin legacy, and while the wound was still fresh, the air felt cleaner. I was no longer a ghost in anyone's machine. I was the architect of my own silence, a silence that didn't hide crimes but protected the peace I had finally earned. As the stars began to needle through the Pennsylvania sky, I realized that the hardest part of a hostile takeover isn't winning the company. It's deciding what to do with the soul you rescued from the ruins. I closed my eyes and listened to the wind in the vines. Finally home, finally quiet.